The sooner the inheritance clears, the sooner we can move her out, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral. And in that moment, standing only a few feet away with a folded memorial program trembling in my hands, I realized that grief was no longer the heaviest thing I would have to carry. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 72 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed I knew exactly who my family was. The sky above the cemetery was the color of worn silver, heavy clouds hanging low over the rolling hills outside Dallas. A cold breeze moved through the rows of white folding chairs, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and roses. Friends and relatives stood in small groups, speaking softly, sharing memories of my husband Richard, a man who had spent 42 years building a life beside me. I should have been listening to them. I should have been focused on the stories, the condolences, the kindness. Instead, I found myself frozen beside a large oak tree near the edge of the gathering, listening to words I was never supposed to hear. Vanessa didn't know I was there. Neither did my son, Ethan. They had stepped away from the crowd, believing they were alone. The sooner the inheritance clears, the sooner we can move her out, Vanessa said quietly. Her voice was calm, practical, almost bored. Ethan didn't answer immediately. I held my breath. Part of me expected him to object, to remind her that his father had been buried less than an hour earlier, to remind her that I was still standing only a short distance away. Instead, he simply sighed. Let's talk about it later, he said. Not no. Not never. Not how could you say that. Just later. The wind seemed to leave my lungs all at once. I stared down at the memorial program in my hands. Richard's photograph smiled back at me from the front cover. The same smile that had greeted me every morning for decades. The same smile that had made difficult years feel easier. The same smile I would never see again except in photographs. Around me, people continued talking. A distant car door closed. Someone laughed softly at a memory Richard would have appreciated. Life moved forward as if nothing had happened, yet everything had changed. I slowly turned away before either of them noticed me. My shoes sank slightly into the damp grass as I walked toward the parking area. I kept my expression neutral. I didn't cry. I didn't confront anyone. After 72 years, I had learned that the most important moments in life often arrived quietly. They didn't announce themselves. They simply revealed the truth. And the truth had just revealed itself to me. By the time I reached my car, my hands had stopped shaking. The sadness remained, but something else had joined it. Something colder. Something clearer. During our marriage, Richard often joked that I was stronger than I realized. Whenever life became difficult, he would smile and say, Maggie, people mistake kindness for weakness. That's their mistake, not yours. Sitting behind the wheel of my car, I heard those words again. For years, I had dismissed them as loving exaggeration. That afternoon, they felt different. Necessary. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes. I barely noticed the traffic. My mind replayed every interaction I'd had with Vanessa during the past year. Small things I had ignored. Questions about finances. Questions about property taxes. Questions about Richard's investments. At the time, I had assumed she was simply taking an interest in family matters. Looking back, those conversations felt different. Sharper. More deliberate. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked unfamiliar. It was the same beautiful brick home Richard and I had purchased more than 30 years earlier. The same flower beds. The same front porch. The same oak tree he had planted when Ethan was 10 years old. Yet something about it felt fragile now, as though I were seeing it through different eyes. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Silence greeted me immediately. The kind of silence that only exists after a great loss. No television. No footsteps. No voice calling from another room. Just stillness. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for several moments. Richard's coffee mug remained beside the sink. His reading glasses rested on the breakfast table exactly where he had left them. For a second, I allowed myself to imagine that he would walk through the door and tell me everything was going to be okay. But reality returned quickly. He was gone. And apparently, some people had already begun calculating what came next. I moved slowly through the house, turning on lamps as evening approached. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed photograph on my nightstand. It had been taken during our 40th wedding anniversary trip to Colorado. Richard's arm rested around my shoulders. We both looked happy, comfortable, certain of our future. A future that now existed only in memories. You knew something, didn't you? I whispered to the photograph. The question surprised even me. I wasn't sure why I asked it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was the memory of the way Richard had watched people during the final months of his life. Thoughtful, observant, as though he were quietly putting pieces together. The room grew darker. Finally, I stood and opened the nightstand drawer beside his side of the bed. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I simply wanted to feel close to him. Inside were old receipts, reading glasses cases, business cards, and a collection of notes he had saved over the years. Then I noticed something I had never seen before. A plain white envelope resting beneath a leather-bound notebook. My name was written across the front in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. Margaret. Nothing else. No explanation. No date. Just my name. My heartbeat quickened. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I carefully lifted the envelope into my hands. It felt heavier than it should have. Outside, the last light of day faded beyond the windows. The house fell completely silent. And as I looked down at the envelope my husband had apparently hidden for me, I suddenly had the unmistakable feeling that Richard Whitmore's final plans were only beginning to unfold. I stood in the fading light of our bedroom, holding the envelope with my name written across the front, and felt an uneasiness that had nothing to do with grief. Richard had never been a dramatic man. He did not leave mysterious messages or create elaborate surprises. For 42 years, he had approached life with steady practicality. If he had hidden this envelope, there had to be a reason. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and turned it over in my hands. The seal had never been broken. For several moments, I simply stared at it, listening to the silence of the house around me. Finally, I slid my finger beneath the flap and opened it. Inside was a folded letter written on cream-colored stationery. The sight of Richard's handwriting immediately tightened something in my chest. I unfolded the pages slowly and began to read. Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened that forced me to prepare for possibilities I hoped would never become necessary. First, know that I love you. I have loved you every day since the moment we met. Second, do not make any decisions until you speak with Daniel Brooks. Promise yourself that. No matter what anyone says, no matter how much pressure they apply, speak with Daniel first. I stopped reading and looked out the bedroom window. The last traces of daylight had almost disappeared. Daniel Brooks had been Richard's attorney for over 20 years. He had handled business contracts, property matters, and eventually estate planning. Richard trusted him completely. I continued reading. There are things I chose not to discuss while I was alive because I hoped I was wrong. I hoped time would prove my concerns unnecessary. If I was wrong, then this letter will simply give you peace of mind. If I was right, Daniel already knows what to do. Trust him. The letter ended with a short sentence that left me staring at the page long after I finished reading. You are stronger than they think. They. Not she. Not he. They. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. My mind raced with questions. What had Richard suspected? What had he seen? More importantly, who exactly did he mean? I slept very little that night. Every time I closed my eyes, memories drifted through my thoughts. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations, small conversations that had once seemed harmless. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside me. The house felt larger without Richard. Every room seemed to echo. I glanced toward the hallway and remembered how he used to walk through the house every evening checking doors and windows before bed. Such a simple routine. Such an ordinary thing. Yet I suddenly missed it more than I could explain. By sunrise, I had made my decision. I would call Daniel. At 9 o'clock sharp, I picked up the phone. His assistant answered immediately. Brooks and Associates. This is Margaret Whitmore, I said. I need to speak with Daniel. There was a brief pause. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Brooks has been expecting your call. Those words sent a chill through me. Expecting my call. Within an hour, I was driving toward downtown Dallas. The city looked exactly as it always had. Traffic moved steadily. Construction crews worked along the roads. People hurried through their normal routines. It felt strange that the world continued unchanged when my own life had shifted so dramatically. Daniel's office occupied the top floor of a modern brick building overlooking a small park. When I entered the reception area, his assistant greeted me warmly and escorted me directly to his office. Daniel stood as soon as I entered. He was in his late 60s now, with silver hair and the calm demeanor that had always made clients trust him. "Margaret," he said gently, "I am very sorry about Richard." "Thank you," I replied. We sat across from one another, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then I removed the envelope from my purse and placed it on his desk. His eyes immediately settled on Richard's handwriting. "You found it," he said quietly. "Yes." Then I suppose Richard's instincts were working until the very end. I leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, what exactly is going on?" He folded his hands together and studied me carefully before answering. "Before we discuss that, I need to ask you a question. Since Richard passed away, has anyone approached you about making major decisions?" The question caught me off guard. What kind of decisions? Selling property, changing living arrangements, transferring assets, anything significant? For a moment I hesitated. Then I told him about the conversation I overheard after the funeral. I repeated Vanessa's exact words. Daniel listened without interruption. When I finished, he slowly nodded as though something had been confirmed. "I was afraid of that," he said. My pulse quickened. "Afraid of what?" He opened a drawer and removed a thick file folder. Richard's name was printed neatly across the tab. "Several months ago, Richard came to me with concerns." "About Vanessa?" Daniel paused. "About more than Vanessa." I felt my stomach tighten. "You mean Ethan too?" Richard noticed changes. He observed conversations, behaviors, financial questions that seemed unusual. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just enough to make him uncomfortable. I stared at the folder. "Why did he never tell me?" Daniel offered a sad smile. "Because he loved you. He hoped he was wrong. He wanted to protect your peace for as long as possible." The room fell silent. Outside the office windows, sunlight reflected off neighboring buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly before fading away. Daniel finally slid the folder across the desk toward me. Richard put safeguards in place, layers of protection. He spent nearly a year reviewing every detail. I rested my hand on the folder, but did not open it. "What kind of safeguards?" Daniel's expression remained calm, but I noticed something firm behind his eyes. Confidence. Certainty. The kind that cannot be undone by impatience, greed, or pressure. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than sadness. Not relief. Not happiness. Something steadier. Richard had known more than I realized. And whatever he had discovered, he had not left me defenseless. Daniel glanced at the envelope once more before looking back at me. "Margaret," he said carefully, "before this is over, some people are going to believe they have already won. When that happens, do not correct them." When I left Daniel's office that afternoon, the city looked different. Nothing had actually changed. Cars still moved through intersections. People still hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Yet I felt as though I had stepped into a version of my life where every familiar thing carried a second meaning. Richard had seen something. Daniel had confirmed it. More importantly, Richard had prepared for it. During the drive home, I kept replaying Daniel's final advice. Some people are going to believe they have already won. When that happens, do not correct them. It sounded simple, but I understood what he meant. Richard had spent a lifetime building successful businesses. He often said that people revealed the most when they felt comfortable, when they believed no one was watching, when they thought the outcome was already guaranteed. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had decided to do exactly what Daniel suggested. I would watch. I would listen. And for the first time in a very long while, I would stop explaining myself to everyone around me. The house greeted me with the same silence as before. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and noticed that my phone contained 3 missed calls. 2 from Ethan, 1 from Vanessa. I stared at the screen for several seconds before calling Ethan back. He answered almost immediately. "Mom, I have been trying to reach you." His voice sounded concerned. Maybe genuinely. Maybe not. I could no longer tell. "I was busy," I said calmly. "Everything okay?" "Of course." A brief pause followed. "Vanessa and I were thinking maybe we could stop by tonight. We should probably talk about a few things." "A few things? Not how are you feeling? Not are you eating? Not do you need anything? Just a few things." "That is fine," I replied. "Come by whenever you like." He sounded relieved. "Great. We will be there around 6. After hanging up, I stood quietly in the kitchen. Then I walked to the refrigerator and removed leftovers from the previous day. I prepared a simple lunch and sat alone at the table. Across from me sat Richard's empty chair. The sight still hurt. I doubted that pain would ever fully disappear. Yet something else had begun replacing the helplessness I felt immediately after his death. Clarity. The afternoon passed slowly. At 6 o'clock sharp, Ethan and Vanessa arrived. Vanessa entered first, carrying a bakery box and wearing an expression that looked carefully rehearsed. "Margaret," she said warmly, "we brought your favorite lemon cake." I thanked her and invited them inside. We sat in the living room, the same room where birthdays had been celebrated. Christmas presents had been opened. Family photographs had been taken. Now it felt more like a conference room than a home. Vanessa glanced toward Ethan before speaking. "We have been worried about you." I nodded politely. "That is kind. Living alone after such a loss can be difficult," she continued, "especially in a house this size." There it was, less than a week after the funeral. Not subtle, not really, just carefully packaged concern. Ethan shifted in his seat. "Vanessa is right, Mom. We just want to make sure you are okay." "I appreciate that. Have you thought about what comes next?" Vanessa asked. "What do you mean?" "Well, practical things." She smiled gently. "Managing the property, maintenance, bills, upkeep. It is a lot for one person." I folded my hands in my lap. "I have managed it before." "Of course," she said quickly. "But maybe this is a good opportunity to consider options." Options. Such a harmless word. Yet I knew exactly what she meant. I remembered her voice near the cemetery. "The sooner we can move her out." "What kind of options?" I asked. Vanessa's smile brightened slightly. "There are some beautiful retirement communities nearby. Wonderful amenities. Activities. Security. People your own age." Ethan nodded. "No pressure, Mom. We are just talking." I looked at both of them. Then I smiled. "I will think about it." The reaction surprised them. I could see it immediately. They had expected resistance, debate, emotion. Instead, I offered none. Vanessa relaxed almost instantly. The conversation moved on to safer topics. Weather, traffic, a new restaurant they had recently visited. Yet beneath every word, I sensed anticipation. They believed they were guiding events toward a predictable outcome. Around 7:30, they finally stood to leave. Vanessa hugged me at the front door. "Remember," she said softly, "you do not have to handle everything alone." "Thank you," I replied. "I will remember that." After they drove away, I remained on the porch watching their taillights disappear down the street. Then I returned inside and locked the door. For several minutes, I stood in the quiet hallway. Finally, I walked into Richard's study. The room smelled faintly of old books and cedar wood. His desk remained exactly as he left it. I sat in his chair and opened the top drawer. Inside lay a yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting. Notes, numbers, reminders, ordinary things. Then I noticed a page near the bottom containing a list of dates from the previous year. Several entries had names beside them. One name appeared more often than any other. Vanessa. I stared at the page. Richard had been paying attention much longer than I realized. Whatever he had discovered, it had not happened overnight. And judging by the confidence I had seen in Vanessa's eyes earlier that evening, she still had no idea how much he knew. The next morning, I returned to Richard's study before breakfast. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles that drifted lazily through the air. For years, this room had been his sanctuary. When business problems became complicated or family matters weighed heavily on his mind, he would retreat here with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. At the time, I thought he simply enjoyed the quiet. Now I wondered how much of that time had been spent observing things he never shared with me. I sat at his desk again and carefully examined the yellow legal pad. Most of the pages contained ordinary notes, appointment reminders, investment reviews, property maintenance schedules. Yet scattered among them were names and dates. Vanessa's name appeared repeatedly, sometimes alone, sometimes beside short phrases that seemed insignificant on their own. Asked again about trust. Questioned timeline. Interested in deed transfer. I stared at the words for a long moment. They were not accusations. Richard had never been careless with facts. He only wrote what he knew. The pattern itself was enough. Over the next hour, I searched through drawers, folders, and cabinets. I found nothing dramatic. No shocking revelation. No secret confession. Instead, I found evidence of something more unsettling. Consistency. Richard had been documenting concerns for months. Not because he wanted conflict, but because he was trying to understand what he was seeing. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. "Ethan." I answered after the second ring. Good morning, Mom. Good morning. I was thinking about stopping by later. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Vanessa found some brochures you might like. I almost smiled. Brochures. For a few retirement communities. Just information. No pressure. No pressure. The phrase was becoming familiar. That is thoughtful, I replied. Bring them if you want. Great. We will stop by after lunch. After we hung up, I placed the phone down and looked around the study. The timing felt interesting. Less than a week after Richard's passing, and conversations about moving me had already become frequent. Yet I followed Daniel's advice. I did not argue. I did not object. If anything, I became more agreeable. That afternoon, Ethan and Vanessa arrived carrying a glossy folder filled with brochures. The covers displayed smiling seniors walking through landscaped gardens and enjoying community activities. Vanessa spread them across the dining room table as though presenting luxury vacation packages. Look at this one, she said enthusiastically. Private cottages, fitness classes, transportation services. It is beautiful. I examined the brochure politely. It certainly looks nice. Vanessa seemed encouraged by my response. And this one is only 15 minutes from us. We could visit all the time. Ethan nodded. You would not have to worry about maintaining a big house anymore. I slowly turned another page. That would certainly simplify things. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Surprise flickered across Vanessa's face. Again, they had expected resistance. Instead, I offered none. The more agreeable I became, the more comfortable they seemed. Over coffee, the conversation drifted naturally toward finances. Or perhaps not so naturally. Vanessa asked whether I had spoken with Daniel yet. The question arrived casually, wrapped in concern. Not recently, I replied. Technically true. I had not spoken with him since yesterday. Do you know when the estate process begins? She asked. I am not sure. These things can take forever, she said with a sigh. The legal system moves so slowly. Ethan glanced at her. Vanessa. What? She said lightly. I am just being realistic. I watched them carefully. Ethan still appeared uncomfortable whenever the subject became too direct. Vanessa, however, seemed increasingly impatient. It was not grief I saw in her expression. It was expectation. After they left, I drove to a small cafe Richard and I used to visit on Saturday mornings. The owner recognized me immediately and offered condolences. I thanked her and ordered coffee. Sitting alone by the window, I found myself remembering conversations from years earlier. Richard had always paid close attention to character. Not appearances, not charm. Character. People eventually show you what matters most to them, he once told me. You just have to be patient enough to notice. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I realized he was talking about life. Later that evening, I received an email from Daniel asking if we could meet again the following day. There was no explanation, just a simple request. The next afternoon, I returned to his office. He greeted me warmly and motioned toward a chair. A thick folder sat on his desk, larger than the one I had seen before. How are things at home? He asked. Interesting, I replied. That earned a small smile. I suspected they might be. He opened the folder and removed several documents. Richard instructed me to wait before showing you these. My pulse quickened. Why? Because timing matters. He slid the papers toward me. And because he wanted certain people to become comfortable first. I looked down at the documents but did not immediately understand what I was seeing. Property records, trust documents, legal amendments. Then I noticed the dates. Most had been completed within the last year. Richard changed all of this. I asked quietly. Yes. Daniel leaned back in his chair. After noticing certain patterns, he decided additional protections were necessary. I slowly turned another page. Protections against what? Daniel held my gaze for several seconds before answering. Against anyone who viewed his passing as an opportunity rather than a loss. A silence settled over the room. Outside the window, traffic moved through the afternoon sunlight. Inside, I felt another piece of the puzzle slide into place. Richard had not been reacting to one conversation, one incident, one misunderstanding. He had spent months preparing for something he feared might happen. And judging by the confidence Vanessa had shown over the past few days, she still believed the future was unfolding exactly as she expected. She had no idea that Richard had been quietly rewriting the rules of the game long before any of us realized we were playing one. When I returned home from Daniel's office, I carried the folder into Richard's study and closed the door behind me. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. For years, quiet had been comforting here. Now it felt like a companion that watched and listened beside me. I sat at Richard's desk and carefully opened the folder. The documents inside were organized with the precision I had always admired in him. Every page was dated. Every amendment was documented. Every decision carried a purpose. The deeper I read, the clearer the picture became. Richard had not acted out of fear. He had acted out of caution. Over the past year, he had restructured portions of his estate, adjusted ownership arrangements, and created layers of protection around assets that mattered most. The family home was among them. So were several investment accounts and properties that had been in our family for decades. He had done all of this quietly. No announcements. No arguments. No family meetings. Just careful preparation. One document caught my attention immediately. Attached to it was a handwritten note. Richard's handwriting remained as familiar to me as my own. The note read, "If pressure begins immediately after my passing, pay attention to who applies it first." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I slowly folded the note and placed it beside me. My phone buzzed. A text message. From Vanessa. "Thinking about you today. Let us know if you need help sorting through Richard's paperwork." I looked at the message and felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. A month earlier, I might have viewed it as kindness. Now I saw something else. Not because of the words themselves. Because of timing. Because of patterns. Because of everything Richard had quietly observed before me. I set the phone down without replying. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor as I prepared coffee. Richard's mug still sat beside the sink. I found myself reaching for it automatically before stopping. Some habits take longer to leave than others. Around 10 o'clock, Ethan called. "Mom, how are you doing today?" he asked. "I am managing." "Good. Vanessa and I were talking last night. We think it might help if we start organizing some things for you." "Organizing? Paperwork? Storage? Long-term planning?" I stirred my coffee slowly. "That sounds very efficient. We just want to make things easier." "Of course." There was a pause. "Have you gone through Dad's files yet?" The question arrived casually, but I noticed it immediately. "A few things," I replied. "Nothing important." Ethan seemed relieved. "Well, do not overwhelm yourself. We can help with all that." "That is very generous." After we ended the call, I stood at the kitchen window looking out toward the backyard. The oak tree Richard planted decades ago swayed gently in the breeze. Ethan used to climb that tree when he was a boy. Richard would stand beneath it with his arms folded, pretending not to worry while watching every movement. Back then, everything seemed simpler. Somewhere along the way, life had become more complicated than either of us expected. That afternoon, I decided to do something I had not done in weeks. I visited my neighbor, Helen. She had lived across the street for nearly 20 years and had known Richard almost as long as I had. We sat on her patio drinking iced tea while the Texas heat settled over the neighborhood. Eventually, the conversation turned toward family. "You seem different," Helen said gently. "Different how?" "More alert." I smiled slightly. "Maybe I am paying closer attention." Helen nodded. "Richard always paid attention." The comment surprised me. "What do you mean?" She looked thoughtful. "Last fall, he asked me something unusual." My heartbeat quickened. "What was that?" "He asked if I had noticed people stopping by your house when neither of you were home." I stared at her. "Really?" I told him I had seen Ethan and Vanessa there several times. Helen shrugged. "I assumed they had a key." I remained silent. "Richard did not seem angry," she continued. "Just curious." Curious. The same word Daniel had used. The same pattern again. Richard gathering information. Watching quietly. Putting pieces together. After leaving Helen's house, I drove home with even more questions than before. Yet one thing had become clear. Richard's concerns had not appeared suddenly. They had grown slowly over time. That evening, I reviewed more documents from the folder. Near the bottom was a sealed envelope marked with instructions from Daniel. "Open only when necessary." I considered opening it immediately. Instead, I placed it back inside the folder. Richard had always believed timing mattered. I trusted him enough to wait. 3 days later, Vanessa invited me to lunch. The invitation arrived unexpectedly. "Just the two of us," she said cheerfully over the phone. "I thought it would be nice to spend some time together." I accepted, not because I trusted her, because I wanted to learn more. We met at a restaurant overlooking a small lake outside the city. The food was excellent. The conversation was carefully controlled. Vanessa spoke about community events, travel plans, and home renovations she hoped to complete someday. Then, almost casually, she steered the discussion toward the future. You know, she said, taking a sip of iced tea, houses like yours are incredibly valuable right now. I nodded. Real estate prices have certainly increased. Exactly. Her smile remained pleasant. It seems like a waste for one person to manage all that space alone. There it was again. Not direct pressure. Not yet. Just gentle suggestions repeated often enough to become familiar. I smiled politely. Perhaps. Vanessa seemed encouraged. I think you deserve something easier. Less responsibility. More freedom. I looked across the table at her carefully composed expression. She genuinely believed she was moving the conversation in the direction she wanted. She believed the future was approaching exactly as planned. For the first time, I understood why Daniel had told me not to correct anyone who thought they had already won. Because confidence creates carelessness. And judging by the certainty I saw in Vanessa's eyes that afternoon, carelessness was getting closer with every passing day. Over the next 2 weeks, I settled into a routine that surprised even me. Every morning, I watered the flowers Richard had planted along the backyard fence. Every afternoon, I reviewed another section of the documents Daniel had given me. Every evening, I answered Ethan's calls with the same calm voice and the same patient smile he could not see through the telephone. The more relaxed I appeared, the more comfortable everyone else became. It was remarkable, really. People reveal so much when they stop viewing you as a threat. One Thursday afternoon, I was organizing old photographs in the dining room when my phone rang. Vanessa. Margaret, she said brightly. I hope I am not interrupting anything. Not at all. Wonderful. Ethan and I were talking about the future again, and we had an idea. I waited. There is a retirement community having an open house this weekend. We thought it might be fun to visit. Fun. The word nearly made me smile. That sounds interesting, I replied. You would come. Her surprise was obvious. Of course, I said. It never hurts to look. When we ended the call, I sat quietly for several moments. Then I reached for my notebook and wrote down the date. Richard had done the same thing. Observe. Record. Pay attention. Saturday arrived warm and bright. Vanessa drove while Ethan sat in the passenger seat. I rode in the back seat watching suburban neighborhoods pass by through the window. Neither of them seemed nervous anymore. In fact, they appeared almost cheerful. The retirement community was beautiful. Walking trails wound through landscaped gardens. Small cottages lined quiet streets. Staff members greeted visitors warmly. Vanessa acted as though she were giving me a grand gift. Can you imagine how relaxing this would be? She asked. No maintenance. No stress. It certainly looks peaceful, I replied. Ethan looked relieved. That is what we were thinking. Throughout the tour, I noticed something interesting. Vanessa talked about my future constantly, but never once asked what I wanted. She spoke about convenience, efficiency, simplicity. Yet none of those conversations included my opinion. The assumption was already built into every sentence. The decision had been made somewhere else. I was merely being guided toward accepting it. Later that afternoon, after returning home, I stood near the kitchen window and watched their car disappear down the street. Then I walked into Richard's study and opened the folder once more. A few pages remained unread. One section contained notes from meetings between Richard and Daniel during the final months of his life. Most were brief summaries. Then I found a line that stopped me cold. If pressure regarding residence increases after my passing, proceed with contingency instructions. I read the sentence 3 times. Residence. Not finances. Not investments. Residence. The house. Richard had anticipated this exact situation. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text message from Ethan appeared on the screen. Hope today was helpful. We just want what is best for you. I stared at the message for a moment before placing the phone face down. Later that evening, Daniel called. How are things progressing? He asked. Faster than I expected. Tell me. I described the retirement community visit, the brochures, the repeated conversations, the increasing focus on moving. Daniel listened carefully. Have they discussed selling the house directly? Not yet. They will. His certainty caught my attention. How can you be so sure? Because Richard predicted the sequence almost exactly. I leaned back in my chair. What did he see that I missed? Daniel was quiet for several seconds. He saw impatience. The answer sounded simple, but I understood immediately. Impatience explained everything. The constant questions, the repeated suggestions, the urgency disguised as concern. People who genuinely cared about my well-being would have focused on healing. These conversations focused on timelines. There is something else, Daniel said. Richard instructed me to wait until a certain point before sharing additional information. What point? When they become confident enough to stop hiding their intentions. The following week, that moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. It happened accidentally. At least, accidentally from their perspective. Ethan and Vanessa stopped by one evening without calling first. I heard their voices in the hallway while I was upstairs sorting old clothing. They assumed I was still in my bedroom. Instead, I was standing near the top of the staircase. Their conversation drifted upward clearly through the quiet house. If she agrees by the end of the month, everything moves much faster, Vanessa said. You do not know that. Ethan sounded uneasy. I do know that. Once the house is listed, the rest becomes easier. My grip tightened slightly on the stair railing. We should slow down, Ethan replied. It has only been a few weeks. Vanessa sighed heavily. That is exactly why we cannot slow down. Silence followed. Then she spoke again, more softly. The longer we wait, the more opportunities there are for things to change. Things to change. Not circumstances. Not grief. Not healing. Just outcomes. I quietly stepped back before they noticed me listening. My heart hurt more for Ethan than for myself. I could hear uncertainty in his voice. Hesitation. Yet he continued moving in the direction Vanessa chose. That night, after they left, I called Daniel. You were right, I told him. About what? They have stopped hiding it. A long pause followed. Then Daniel said something that made me sit perfectly still. Good. That means we are almost ready for the next step. I looked toward the darkened hallway outside Richard's study. What next step? The one Richard spent a year preparing. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and sat alone on the back porch with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands. The air was still. The neighborhood remained quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler clicked rhythmically across a lawn. For the first time since Richard passed away, I felt something close to certainty. Not certainty about how everything would end, but certainty that my husband had seen the truth long before I had. The previous evening's conversation echoed in my mind. We are almost ready for the next step. Daniel had sounded calm when he said it. Confident. As though he had been following a map that Richard himself had drawn. Around 9 o'clock, I drove downtown for another meeting. Daniel greeted me the same way he always did, with a firm handshake and steady eye contact. This time, however, there was a second folder waiting on the conference table. Unlike the others, it was sealed with a blue tab. Daniel sat across from me and folded his hands. Richard instructed me to wait until this exact stage before opening that folder. I looked down at it. Why? Because he believed people eventually become predictable when they think they are close to getting what they want. Daniel carefully opened the folder and removed several documents. Then he slid a handwritten letter toward me. The moment I saw Richard's handwriting, my throat tightened. This was written 6 months ago, Daniel said quietly. I unfolded the pages and began reading. Margaret, if you are reading this, then certain concerns I had were not simply worries. They were warnings. I hope I was wrong. I truly do. But if I was right, then I need you to trust something. Do not fight. Do not argue. Do not defend yourself. Let people reveal exactly who they are. I paused and looked up. Daniel nodded. Keep going. I continued reading. The temptation will be to confront them. Resist it. Truth is more powerful when people expose themselves. I sat silently for several moments after finishing the letter. The words sounded exactly like Richard. Practical, patient, thoughtful. He had never been a man who rushed into conflict. He believed that character always surfaced eventually. Daniel leaned forward slightly. There is more. He handed me another document. This one was legal, detailed, complex. Yet one section immediately captured my attention. It outlined a special trust arrangement Richard had created during the final year of his life. Certain assets, including the family home, could not be sold, transferred, or altered under specific conditions. Additional provisions existed as well, layers upon layers of protection. Richard wanted to ensure that no one could pressure you into decisions during a period of grief, Daniel explained. He considered emotional vulnerability a risk factor. I almost laughed through my sadness. That sounded exactly like something Richard would say. Even after decades of marriage, he was still finding ways to protect me. Do Ethan and Vanessa know any of this? I asked. Daniel shook his head. No. Will they eventually? Yes. He paused. At the appropriate time. Over the next week, I followed Richard's instructions exactly. I stopped resisting suggestions. In fact, I became more agreeable than ever. When Vanessa brought new retirement brochures, I thanked her. When Ethan talked about simplifying my future, I listened politely. When conversations drifted toward the house, I nodded thoughtfully. The effect was immediate. Their confidence grew. Vanessa especially seemed relieved. The caution I had seen during the early weeks began fading. She smiled more, spoke more openly, assumed more. One Sunday afternoon, they invited me to lunch at their home. During dessert, Vanessa casually mentioned real estate values in our neighborhood. Your house would probably sell very quickly, she observed. The market is still strong. I stirred my tea slowly. That may be true. Her eyes brightened slightly. Have you thought any more about downsizing? A little. Ethan looked surprised by my answer. Vanessa looked pleased. Neither realized I was studying their reactions far more closely than their words. Later that afternoon, while Ethan stepped outside to take a phone call, Vanessa remained in the kitchen with me. For the first time, she stopped pretending entirely. Not openly, not dramatically, just enough. Richard was always very careful with money, she said. Sometimes too careful. I looked at her. Perhaps. She smiled. The future belongs to people willing to move forward. It was such an ordinary sentence. Yet beneath it, I heard everything she truly meant. Move forward. Move assets. Move ownership. Move me. I smiled gently and changed the subject. That evening, after returning home, I called Daniel. They are becoming comfortable, I told him. Good, he replied. That means the process is working. What process? The one Richard designed. I stood near the study window looking out at the darkening backyard. How much longer? There was a brief pause. Not much longer. In fact, I think it is time to schedule the family meeting. I turned slowly toward Richard's desk. The family meeting? Yes. Daniel's voice remained calm. Everyone will be there. You, Ethan, Vanessa, and me. My heartbeat quickened. What happens at the meeting? Another pause followed. Then Daniel answered with quiet certainty. The moment your husband spent a year preparing for finally arrives. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon at Daniel's office. During the days leading up to it, something shifted in the atmosphere around me. Vanessa no longer hid her confidence. She still spoke politely, still smiled warmly, still framed every suggestion as concern, but the careful restraint I had seen during the early weeks was gone. She behaved like someone approaching a finish line. Ethan seemed different as well. Not excited. Not exactly. More restless. More distracted. Several times he called asking whether I was comfortable with the meeting. Each time I assured him that I was. The truth was that I had never felt calmer. Richard's plan had carried me this far, and I intended to follow it all the way to the end. On Wednesday evening, Vanessa stopped by unexpectedly. She brought a casserole and spoke cheerfully about ordinary things for nearly 20 minutes before finally arriving at the subject she truly wanted to discuss. Tomorrow should help everyone move forward, she said while standing in my kitchen. It will be good to have clarity. I nodded. I agree. She studied my face carefully. You seem very calm. I smiled. Richard always said that worrying never improved a situation. She laughed softly. That sounds like him. For a brief moment, something almost looked like guilt in her expression. Then it vanished. Whatever uncertainty she once possessed had long since been replaced by expectation. After she left, I walked into Richard's study and sat quietly at his desk. The room felt familiar now. Not painful in the way it had during those first lonely days. Comforting. Protective. I opened the drawer where I kept his letters and read several of them again. One sentence stood out more than ever. Let people reveal exactly who they are. By the next afternoon, I found myself sitting in Daniel's conference room overlooking downtown Dallas. The city stretched across the windows behind him. Ethan sat to my right. Vanessa sat beside him. Daniel occupied the head of the table. Several folders rested neatly before him. Vanessa looked remarkably relaxed. She had dressed carefully, as though attending an important business meeting. Ethan appeared less comfortable. He kept adjusting his watch and avoiding eye contact. Daniel exchanged a brief glance with me before opening the first folder. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "There are several matters regarding Richard Whitmore's estate that need formal review." Vanessa straightened slightly in her chair. Daniel continued speaking in his usual measured tone. He reviewed financial information, property holdings, investment structures, trust arrangements. Everything sounded routine, professional, predictable. As the meeting progressed, I noticed Vanessa becoming increasingly pleased. Every mention of assets seemed to reinforce whatever assumptions she had already built in her mind. Then the conversation turned toward the family home. Daniel opened another folder. Vanessa's attention sharpened immediately. Ethan leaned forward. "Regarding the residence," Daniel said, "there are several important provisions Richard established during the final year of his life." For the first time, Vanessa interrupted. "What kind of provisions?" Daniel looked at her calmly. "Protective provisions." The room grew quieter. "Protective against what?" she asked. Daniel ignored the question and continued reading. As he spoke, I watched their expressions carefully. Confusion appeared first, then surprise, then uncertainty. Certain assumptions they had carried into the room were beginning to weaken. Yet neither of them understood how much remained hidden. Daniel eventually closed the folder and folded his hands. "There is one final matter Richard instructed me to address personally." Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. I remained silent. Daniel opened a sealed envelope. The same blue-tabbed envelope he had shown me days earlier. He removed several pages and adjusted his glasses. This document was prepared 6 months ago and contained specific instructions regarding the administration of certain family assets. Vanessa's smile disappeared completely. Ethan looked concerned. Daniel continued reading. Every word seemed to increase the tension in the room. Not because anyone was arguing, not because voices were raised, because expectations were quietly colliding with reality. I watched Vanessa carefully. For the first time since Richard's funeral, genuine uncertainty appeared in her eyes. She had entered the room expecting confirmation. Instead, she was receiving questions, limitations, conditions, delays. Daniel finally set the document down. Silence settled across the conference table. Outside the windows, afternoon sunlight reflected from nearby buildings. Inside, no one spoke. Then Vanessa cleared her throat. "There must be more," she said. Daniel nodded once. "There is." He reached for one final folder, the largest one on the table. The folder Richard had spent a year preparing. The folder Daniel had protected until this exact moment. My heartbeat remained steady as he opened it. Across from me, Vanessa looked suddenly uneasy. Beside her, Ethan appeared confused and worried. Neither of them understood that the meeting they believed would secure their future was only now truly beginning. Daniel opened the final folder slowly, almost reverently, and for a moment no one in the room moved. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the conference table. The city skyline reflected in the windows behind him. Ethan sat rigidly beside Vanessa. Vanessa's confidence had faded into visible tension. I remained silent. Richard had asked me to trust the process. I intended to honor that request until the very end. Daniel removed a thick document from the folder and placed it before him. "This is the final instruction package Richard Whitmore prepared regarding the long-term administration of his estate." Vanessa shifted in her chair. "I thought we already reviewed the estate structure." Daniel glanced at her briefly. "You reviewed the standard structure. This is different." The room fell silent again. Daniel adjusted his glasses and began reading. The document outlined several conditions Richard had established before his passing. Certain assets would remain protected for years. Major decisions involving family property required additional approvals. Trust distributions followed a schedule designed specifically to prevent impulsive actions during periods of emotional vulnerability. As Daniel continued, I watched Ethan's face carefully. He looked increasingly confused. Vanessa looked increasingly concerned. Neither reaction surprised me. Then Daniel reached the section Richard had apparently considered most important. He paused before continuing. "There is an attached personal statement from Richard Whitmore. He requested that it be read aloud during this meeting." My throat tightened. Even after all these weeks, hearing Richard's name spoken in the present tense still stirred something deep inside me. Daniel unfolded a separate document and began reading. "To my family. If this letter is being read, then circumstances unfolded in a way I hoped they would not. I spent my life believing that character matters more than money, more than property, more than inheritance. Character reveals itself through choices, especially during difficult times. Daniel's voice remained calm and steady. Across the table, Vanessa stared downward. Ethan looked at his hands. If grief is treated as an inconvenience, pay attention. If compassion disappears too quickly, pay attention. If conversations about assets become more important than conversations about people, pay attention. I felt tears gathering in my eyes, but I did not look away. These were Richard's words, Richard's observations, Richard's final gift. Daniel continued, I chose not to punish anyone. I chose instead to protect the people I love and allow time to reveal intentions naturally. The future of this family should be determined by integrity, patience, and respect, not urgency. Not entitlement, not pressure. The room remained completely silent. Even the sounds of traffic outside seemed distant. Then Daniel reached the final section. The family residence shall remain solely under Margaret Whitmore's authority for as long as she chooses. No beneficiary, relative, advisor, or interested party may compel, influence, or accelerate any transfer, sale, or relocation decision involving her residence. Any attempt to do so automatically delays certain discretionary distributions contained within the trust structure. Vanessa's head lifted immediately. Delays distributions? Daniel nodded once. Yes. For how long? She asked. Several years. The answer landed heavily. Ethan stared at Daniel. Several years. Correct. Daniel folded the document neatly. Your father considered this provision extremely important. Vanessa's face lost what little color remained. There has to be some mistake. Daniel calmly slid another document across the table. There is no mistake. Ethan picked up the page and began reading. As he did, his expression changed. Not anger, not frustration, something sadder. Recognition. Piece by piece, he was beginning to understand what his father had seen, what his father had feared, what his father had prepared for. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Ethan looked toward me. For the first time in weeks, he held my gaze without looking away. Mom, he said quietly, did you know about this? I considered the question carefully. Not at first. He lowered his eyes. Vanessa remained completely silent. The certainty she carried into the meeting had vanished. Daniel gathered the documents into neat stacks. Richard spent almost a year designing these protections. He revised them multiple times. Every decision was deliberate. Ethan nodded slowly. He really thought all of this through. Yes, Daniel replied. He did. The meeting ended shortly afterward. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no emotional speeches, just the quiet weight of truth settling over everyone in the room. As we stood to leave, Ethan approached me. He looked older than he had a month earlier. Tired, reflective. I am sorry, he said softly. I studied his face. The face of the little boy who once climbed the oak tree in our backyard. The face Richard had been so proud of. I know, I replied. It was the truth. For the first time, I believed he genuinely was. Vanessa remained near the door, unusually quiet. Whatever she wanted to say never came. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalk as I stepped onto the street. Daniel walked beside me for a moment. Richard would be proud of you, he said. I smiled faintly. Richard did all of this. Daniel shook his head. No. Richard built the bridge. You were the one who crossed it. After he returned inside, I stood alone for a moment looking toward the Dallas skyline. Life was not suddenly perfect. I still missed my husband every day. I still walked into rooms expecting to hear his voice. I still reached for a second coffee cup some mornings before remembering. Grief does not disappear because a problem is solved. But something important had changed. The fear was gone. The uncertainty was gone. The house Richard loved remained my home. The future remained mine to choose. And as I drove back toward the neighborhood where we had built our life together, I found myself smiling for the first time in many weeks. At the beginning of this journey, some people believed they were waiting for an inheritance. What they failed to understand was that Richard's greatest legacy was never money. It was wisdom, patience, character. And in the end, those were the things that protected me most.